Welcome, young scholars, to
Have we started?
chapter 3. And I'm feeling midweekish,
Yes.
and as a consequence, I'm feeling like I'm really interested in biting down on a good piece of literature today.
Where's the axe? No wood chopping today?
Unclear. I'm a scholar, and there's no requirement for the tools of a trade for me today.
Okay.
Anyway.
All right, so we have a new Mr. Turner with us today, obviously. Ladies and gentlemen, we wanted to separate this one from chapters 1 and 2 and look at chapter 3 today. We've looked at the dinner party, we've looked at the party at Myrtle's, and now we're going to look at Gatsby's first party. Any beginning thoughts, Mr. Turner?
Well, I think that as we start to see Gatsby's house, Nick gives us an explanation as to what the house looks like. I believe, is that correct?
I think he does that actually in chapter 1.
That's in chapter 1. I do want to return to that, though, because
Okay.
we're going to talk a little bit about that third party, but we haven't talked about the house just yet.
No, we haven't.
Maybe you could find the passage
Absolutely.
as my...
Absolutely. What, in fact, did you want to talk about with the house? Would you like me to read the passage?
Yes, let's have that then.
All right. This is back in chapter 1. Sorry. He's talking about where he lives, and he says, "I lived at West Egg. Well, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. I want to come back to that in a second. But the one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month."
So right away, this description of Gatsby's mansion is interesting. It's brand new, as Nick reports, brand spanking new under ivy, suggesting it looks almost like a castle. Why the facade? Why create something that looks old but is in fact new? And in incorporating the ivy, it indicates something maybe more established.
Right.
And I guess what I'm getting at is that this looks like a package that maybe has something a little bit more sinister inside.
Well, and I think when you contrast it with the brief description that we get of Tom and Daisy's house, right? This Georgian colonial house, right? You know how much I love Georgian houses.
Yes.
Right? Georgian houses were known, for anybody with architecture, they were known because they were absolutely symmetrical, and I love Georgian style. But very established, Georgian referring to King George in England, so very established as a style. This is a castle, and there was a big push for people coming to the United States to replicate that idea of nobility, of royalty, and so they wanted castles created. But as Mr. Turner said, it's interesting that he's made a home that is to look like it's established and old. But it's really not. It's brand spanking new.
It would kind of be like if you and I were to live in the area. I would likely be in the East Egg, that place where we have, the fundamental decencies given to us.
Where are we going with this, Mr. Turner?
Well, I see you as potentially a West Egg kind of girl with your...
Go Griffins. Really?
With your dog hair covered.
You made us get a yellow lab. Anyway, let's get back to it. All right. You're right, and I think that is important because that continues on in chapter 3 when we get to see more of the house.
I think one would get tired of being told they are right, but in fact, it's not a case.
The other thing I wanted to mention about the price of a season, and many years ago, maybe 20 years ago or so, I was listening to an interview with a real estate agent, and he was talking about the prices of places in the Hamptons. This is essentially the Hamptons of New York. This is the really fabulously wealthy thing. And the journalist went along with the real estate agent, and they were looking at homes, and he was rhyming off prices, millions and millions of dollars for this home and that home and that home. And then the real estate agent pointed to one house, and he said, well, that one's $650. And the journalist said, well, I could afford $650, right? This was 20 years ago. And he said, oh, no. That was $650 to rent for the season. That was May, Memorial Day in the United States, to Labor Day. That was $650,000 to rent a place for the season. That wasn't to buy. Can you imagine? And he's talking about 10 to 15 for the season. Again, we understand the difference of price for sure. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with the house?
I think it's just that we need to make sure that we understand that this is a house that's made to look like old money, but it is in fact very new money.
Right, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit.
Don't point that thing; it's got a nail in it. Move forward, please.
All right. I wanted to start off, we're going to try to highlight some points. Obviously, we expect you to have read the entire chapter. We're just going to highlight a couple of points. And the first one I wanted to read is on the first page of chapter 3, where Nick tells us, he says, every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruiterer in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. Did you want to go ahead with any thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, immediately I'm drawn again to Death of a Salesman, and Willie Loman. He says to Howard when he finds out that Howard is firing him, he says, "You can't eat the pulp and throw the peel away."
I think he actually says fruit.
You can't eat the fruit
and then throw the peel away.
Yes.
You don't have the text. I get it.
And so he even says to be further, he says a man is not a piece of fruit. But in fact, that's exactly what Willie ends up being. He is that orange that he wasn't even a very good orange, but the company sucked him dry of all the juice, and then you're out of here.
All right.
So I think that what we start to come to understand here is that just like the fruit that comes in full and leaves empty as shells, so do the people. They're coming in filled with the understanding that this is going to be a grand time and it's going to be fantastic. However, it's going to be fruitless endeavor, because it's just going to be a colossal waste of time. People are going to get drunk and misbehave.
Right, absolutely, and you see that at the end of chapter 3. I also wanted just to highlight the decadence of the fruit and of the oranges and lemons coming in. Again, we're looking at the 20s, and so we're used to oranges and lemons being plentiful and in our grocery store all the time, but that wasn't the case in the 20s. They were citrus fruit was considered to be an absolute extravagance. So to have them brought in, and a butler being able to press a button 200 times, the butler doing it, right? The butler, the hired help as well is important in that case. We continue on. He gives us a huge description of the decadence of these parties. The people are out. He talks about his car, his Rolls Royce taking people to and from the city. He talks about his station wagon bringing people from the train station. He says that there was no just little 5-piece affair when it talked about the orchestra. It was a whole pit full of oboes and trombones and saxophones. Thank you. But here's the interesting thing I thought. Is when he talks about the people meeting one another, and he says the enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. And I've always thought of, those air kisses, right? When people go, oh, hi, oh yes, and they pretend to be so fascinated. That's exactly what we're seeing here. These people could care less about each other. Couldn't care less about it. I know, I always get caught on that one.
They care less?
They couldn't care less.
They might be able to care less as well.
You should be paying attention to color. Just before we came down here, I said to Mr. Turner, I said, what does he mean by yellow cocktail music? And it's interesting. If you look it up, there's all kinds of different sort of versions of it, what it means. And one critic said that Fitzgerald should have probably been a jazz critic. because of his way of describing the music in that. And I thought it was interesting that there's an album by the Brian Ferry Orchestra. You guys wouldn't recognize it, it's all right, Mr. Turner would, called Yellow Cocktail Music.
Yellow Cocktail.
So obviously an allusion to Gatsby. Anyway, just one of those interesting points. But notice yellow all the way through. It becomes very important.
I think you're probably getting drowned out by the wind right
I'm
now.
going to try to speak a little bit louder, and hopefully we'll be able to get by. All right. Yeah, our Canadian flag is making a lot of noise right now. Okay. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door.
I feel like this is something like that happens on the Snapchat Instagram, where it locates where the kids are starting to congregate, and then they just, like moths to a flame, they end up at that place. Parties get out of control, and bad stuff happens.
Interesting. He actually refers to some of the women as moths.
Moths. Oh
They
my
are
gosh.
attracted to that light. They are attracted to the party while the lights are on.
Sometimes it's difficult. Yes. The
Sometimes
intellect
it's difficult
gets,
being right.
The
Yes.
intellect gets in the way.
So he says, I had been actually invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. We don't get a sense of it's little at all, right? So he dresses, he goes to the party. At one point, again, we have twin yellow dresses mentioned. He sees Jordan. He meets Jordan and he says, oh my gosh, he said, I remember you lived next door, and she was hoping to see him. And there's a whole conversation. But at one point, one of the guests is referred to as Mr. Mumble. And again, it highlights the fact that nobody cares who these people are. Right, Mr. Mumble, hi, I'm Mr. Mumble. All right, it doesn't matter. I don't care what your name is, so I'm not going to pay attention to that as well. Right, we've got all kinds of rumors going on about Gatsby, etc. But then we come to the library.
Yes.
And this is important because this ties back to what Mr. Turner was saying about the facade of the building. And there's a gentleman who's referred to as the Owl-Eyed Man. We never get his name, but he is the Owl-Eyed Man. And he notices something very important about the books in the library. Before you, because I'm gonna let you analyze this, but I want you to imagine this is my dream library. This is floor to ceiling. This is where you see those ladders that move, right? And you've got ladders that get you to different shelves, and oh my gosh, and leather-bound books that look beautiful and smell
all right,
beautiful,
get
and
to
leather
it.
chairs.
Okay.
Oh, can I have one, please?
Nothing like a date at the library on a Friday night.
Hey, it's a good thing. Anyway,
Nerd.
tell us about the library. Or tell us about the books.
two things. Owl eyes, okay, suggests that there's a wisdom there,
Right.
like the owl, the wise old owl, and so we see that he is somebody who sees more clearly than the rest of the plebeian people who are there. In fact, he's taken himself away from that to do some investigating,
Right.
and he finds himself in the library. And what he notes, did you explain did you read the passage?
No, I
Or
haven't.
oh,
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay.
Chop. Come on, let's go.
Chop, chop.
Get busy.
As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. What do you think? He demanded impetuously. About what? He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real. The books? He nodded. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and here, let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. See, he cried triumphantly, it's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fella's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness. What realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?
So immediately what Owl Eyes imagines, he's already seen through Gatsby. He's noticing that he's a bit of a con artist, that all of this is simply a facade, again, the fronted kind of show that is, for whatever reason, he doesn't know why, and he's actually amazed that they're real books, because he imagines that they would actually be just cardboard cutouts of books, and so the fact that they're real impresses him
Right.
because they're physical, real books of, and so somebody that Gatsby knew filled that library with proper books that made sense to the people of the time, that would be part of that community, who would have access to that kind of knowledge. The problem is that when they used to publish books, they would publish the front and the back piece of paper as one piece of paper, and then it would get bound against the spine. And in fact, what you would have to do is you would read the page, you would take a knife, and just like a folded piece of paper, you would have to cut along that outside fold.
For anybody who loves books like I do, Mr. Turner is not one of them, but anybody who does is, you know what we're talking about when
Clearly,
you see those.
I have very bad judge of character.
Hey, you see when you have the pages that look slightly ripped on them, and it just adds something to the luxuriousness of that book. Well, that's where it comes from, that idea of cutting each page. And just to go back, I know that I grew up in a household with theater, and my father, when he was designing stages, he had to use what were called book forms, and he would paint them, and then they would put them in so that the set people didn't have to fill up with books. Well, that's what people did in these libraries, was especially up in the top shelves, they would have these forms that were painted to look real, but they weren't, because it was, again, that facade. But Gatsby has gone, as Mr. Turner said, Gatsby has gone and created this real library, but he hasn't cut the pages. So we know he hasn't read any of the books.
It's kind of like watching the movie instead of reading the book.
How many of our students do you figure will do that?
I like to err on the side of good, whereas you have a streak
That
of
is-
evil
that is
within
not
you.
true.
That's hard to imagine. But I would say that probably about 80% of the kids are going to read the books, and probably those 20% are going to watch a movie.
I know that a couple of my students have already said they've read the entire book already. I don't know about yours.
Well,
anyway.
likely.
Just a quick note, Belasco was a famous playwright and had a massive, massive library. That's the reference there. Anyway, not terribly important. Okay, so we finally meet Gatsby. We meet Gatsby, and
I'm
we hear...
Gatsby.
I'm Gatsby. Then
I'm
the fireworks
Gatsby.
have to go off behind you as you're holding up a glass.
Well, that doesn't happen in the book.
Oh, but it does in the movie. Anyway,
Leo. My heart speeds up a little bit every time I think about Leonardo DiCaprio.
Absolutely. Now, what does he call Nick? Go
Old
on.
sport.
Old sport, absolutely. And, you know...
Why are you so obtuse, old sport?
What's the importance of old sport? What does that ring to you when you hear old sport? What does that suggest?
Yeah, it's collegiality. It's we're buddies. We're on the same team. Old sport, and that we are
I think we're a little bit snobby. I think we're
Snotty?
English, right? Snobby, snooty,
snooty,
snotty.
snotty.
Ferris Bueller. Anyway, I think that has to be
We
that.
already did that one.
I think we did. It's all right.
There's no news stories.
Well, Fry would agree with
Fry.
you, right? Sorry to the grade 11s. I don't know. Did you teach Fry?
Cameron Fry.
No, not Cameron
Fry.
Fry. Northrop Fry.
Fry.
Anyway, back.
Sorry.
Come on. Oh, now I've got a brain fart. What was I saying?
I don't think you can say that.
Well, my kids know I say it all the
Okay,
time.
that sounds dirty and bad.
Dirty?
Gross. Yeah.
It's a brain fart. It just, I forget what I was going to say.
Okay.
What was I saying? Old
don't know.
sport.
Old
English. Right? It sounds very old sport, right?
Old
Remember,
sport.
where did he go to school? He went to school in Oxford.
Oxford.
Old
He's an
time.
Oxford,
Oxford
man.
man.
Lately, we'll hear he's an Oxford.
Oxford man, absolutely. All right, so we meet him, right? He finally, he says, I'm Gatsby, and Nick says, oh, I beg your pardon. Then he continues, Nick says, he smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced or seemed to face the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor.
I feel that people who know me would suggest that when I give them a smile, it's much like that. Reassuring, confidence in the future, that everything is going to be okay and good, and that I'm actually going to be on your team every chance that I can to help you out, because I am a selfless individual who only wants to see your boat float higher. Really good.
You don't look in anybody else's bowl.
I don't.
No.
That's
Okay.
my point.
Anyway, moving on.
I'll try and flash one of those at the end.
So you can see that importance of the smile. Remember, we talked about Daisy's voice, we have Gatsby's smile. So I'm not going to go into too much detail now for the next couple of pages.
Really?
But it's important to understand that we get a lot of rumors about Gatsby. We get a lot of stories about him. We know that this
Timex Social Club for those rumors.
or Fleetwood Mac rumors.
Sure. Music is, it's important.
It is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Tupac's
Anyway,
probably got one called Rumors. I don't know. Maybe.
could we stop?
Sorry, carry on.
All right. So I want you to think now that this party, as Mr. Turner mentioned earlier, has now descended into debauchery, right?
Woohoo.
There's alcohol. Remember,
Yeah.
this is prohibition. There's not supposed to be alcohol. Gatsby doesn't drink. That's the other thing that's important to understand. But there's debauchery, there's crying, there's arguing, there's husbands that want to leave and their wives don't want to. And then, of course, there's the car accident. Do you remember what happens with the car accident? A whole wheel gets knocked off the car. And one of the words that I use a lot when I talk about Gatsby is that Fitzgerald likes to foreshadow, and he is quite prescient in his writing.
That's a very large word.
Well,
Spell that word?
Really?
I-
Prescient. Prescient. He pre-sees things. We talk about omniscient. He is prescient. He pre-sees. Right?
Okay.
The interesting thing here is
You're
that,
really smart.
oh my gosh, stop.
Sorry, carry on.
Is that there's a lot of thoughts that Fitzgerald may have had some ideas of what was to come, that this party atmosphere of the 20s was going to come to an end. It was going to end badly. I thought you were supposed to be academic, remember?
Well,
Academic man.
academics can see the future, and I see the future. I know what's coming.
So we have the crying, we have this car accident, etc. And I think that the important thing to understand is that the owl-eyed man is the one, right? He says, don't ask me. I know very little about driving. Next to nothing. It happened, and that's all I know. There's no understanding. There's no one claiming responsibility for this accident either.
Uh-oh.
I've never thought about that before. Honestly, it
Nobody-
just came to me that nobody claims responsibility.
Nobody claims responsibility. Nobody, and that's for people who've already read the novel,
You're going to figure that out, right?
Right?
And somebody says, back out, he suggested after a moment. Put her in reverse. And somebody responds and says, but the wheel's off. Well, there's no harm in trying, he said. And so it's this oblivious nature as well.
Obliviousness?
Obliviousness.
Yeah, great
absolutely, right? We'll continue on. As I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail. We learn a little bit about...
kind of speed it up a
We're
little.
we're actually done, really,
very
right?
good.
But there's, well,
Finally,
sort
all
of
the
done.
kids can get on with their day now.
Anyway, is that we get to know Jordan. Remember I mentioned about her being a cheater in golf. We get to hear the story of that. And we know that she gets away with it because she's wealthy, right? She's paid somebody off. She's paid that referee, or not referee in golf. What's the word I'm looking for? A caddy retracted his statement. We know he's been paid off to do this. And then Nick says they're driving, and he says, you're a rotten driver, I protested. Either you ought to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all. And she says, I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are. What's that got to do with it? They'll keep out of my way. It takes two to make an accident.
Oh.
Again, for those of you who've read the book, you know where I'm going with this. Jordan believes that it's everybody else's responsibility. Remember, she stands for nothing. She does nothing. And so she believes it's other people's responsibility to get out of her way. And so that becomes an essential thing there. And then Nick says, suppose you met somebody just as careless as yourself. She said, I hope I never will, she answered. I hate careless people. That's why I like you. But here's you know what, I'm not going to analyze that one because you have to just pay attention to this idea of carelessness, okay? And that's going to come in
The reality is
later.
that probably some of them could care less about any of this.
Right. Well, okay.
I mean
let's-
them.
Oh, for sure. But
And
let's think about Nick Caraway.
care away.
He
Away.
could care less. He couldn't care.
Well,
now, I can't take credit for that one. I
okay.
stole that from
No,
John Green.
For sure you
so.
can. So, but maybe it's not necessary. He has a care to begin with.
Right.
But that care leaves him.
Mm.
And I don't read this John Green fellow, but I
John Green does a great series on literature online on YouTube. You can look it up. He does a great series on Gatsby. It is actually really good. He's quite funny.
My favorite,
he does history as well for anybody else.
My favorite YouTuber is what is that fellow's name? He da 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 da, and it's
What are you talking about?
I'm gonna have to. It's too much time.
Okay.
So remember the guy who sits with a glass of scotch and he
oh
tells us,
oh my gosh, Thug Notes.
Thug Notes.
What's his name? I can't remember his
Well,
name.
I don't
Anyway,
know,
Thug
but
Notes is
Thug
quite funny.
Notes and-
Thug Notes, I can't totally suggest it because there are a few words, especially in the
Edgy,
Gatsby ones, that are a
edgy.
little edgy.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't watch that. But I have seen one or two, and that are clean and they're quite good.
He does a good job. His Macbeth one is quite good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Shuggy Sparks. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Last line of the chapter. I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known.
Oh.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't think so on that one. I don't think so. Okay, so we're gonna leave that now, and what we've asked you to do is read 4, 5, and 6, and look at those quotations. We apologize. Technology baffles me a little
your
bit. So it seems like all three classes are sharing the same document. My
anymore.
apologies. No,
I-
are you fixed?
That sounds. No, I don't know if I think.
You think you're fixed. All right, so maybe my two classes are sharing one and your class is finally on its own.
Maybe.
Anyway, my apologies for that, guys. We do our best, right? Absolutely. Okay, so
I don't know if that's necessarily your best, but it's a good try. So you're very trying.
thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.
Peace out.
Toodles.
Toodles. Go Tigers. And Tigers always kill warriors. True story.